Welcome to Elmer's Shooting Emporium, and we do away with all that fancy shooting nonsense. All you need ain't one of them scary AR-15s. It's a bolt action. And to make things even crazier, on this particular bolt action, I have it loaded with some of the deadliest, and I do mean deadliest, bounce around 100% death rounds. These rounds, when they go in a perpetrator, will ricochet around the body, causing massive damage. Deadliest round known to man. It's crazy. Now, there is one concession I have made to the new crowd, and that is a suppressor, and that's just because Myrtle says I get too loud out here. So, but this is all you need for home defense. Little 22. Ain't no recoil. Gertrude can shoot it fine. Reliable. I ain't made of, well, this one is made of plastic and the dog could shoot it up, but I guess a lot of them aren't. And it's just fantastic. This is all you need. You're actually watching The Hungry Handgunner, and I'm Nick, not Elmer, and I like all sorts of stuff that goes pew, including old school, new school, bolt action, all the things. But I made a video fairly recently about Fuddery, and it was some of the top Fudd lore that I had heard, and there may be some redundancy in this video, so forgive that. But I was corrected in the comments, and I realized that, well, if we were going to tackle Fudd lore, we should do a comprehensive, all-inclusive guide to it. So that's what we're going to do today. So I do want to go ahead, just like I did in the other video, and state that age is not really a qualifying factor for a Fudd. Sometimes you get boomer Fudds, sometimes you get Gen X Fudds, and sometimes you get millennial and Zoomer, Gen Z, whatever, Fudds. They can run the gamut. So I will say that some Fudd lore aspects do tend to be espoused more by certain generations. By no means, though, is Fudd a euphemism for an age thing, at least not for me. So, got that out of the way. So we're going to go ahead and dive into the various categories and definitions of Fudd, and some examples. This should be fun. So if you want to take out a piece of paper and see if you fall anywhere on the Fudd spectrum, feel free to do that. Don't get mad at me if you do. I don't make the rules. This is stuff I found on the internet, so it's got to be true, right? All right, let's get started. So perhaps one of the best known examples of Fuddery is the people that say things like, I support the Second Amendment, but, and that's normally followed up by, don't think people need bump stocks, I don't think people need suppressors or silencers, or I don't think people need binary triggers. It's a exclusionary support for the Second Amendment. And where that gets to be a problem is, today, it could be bump stocks. Tomorrow, it could be semi-autos. The day after that, it could be lever actions. It tends to be a slippery slope, especially when you look at the purported meaning and reasoning behind gun laws is to cut down on gun violence. Well, a lot of the proposed measures that they have do absolutely nothing to curb gun violence. So it stands to reason if they ban bump stocks and that doesn't affect that number, then something else is going to be on the chopping block. And eventually they're going to come around to something that you care about, even if those things are something you don't personally give two hoots about. So for me personally, I don't care about bump stocks. I don't want one, whatever. I am vehemently opposed to them being banned, though, if that makes sense. Full autos were banned before I was born. Again, do I want one? Well, not with these ammo prices, but I think they should be legal. And somebody somewhere is going to get upset with that. But that's where I'm at with it. You can also run into things like felons and Second Amendment rights. And I know I'm about to tick people off with this one, but it is what it is. My personal opinion is that if you are convicted of a crime, felony or not, and you serve your sentence, the court has handed down a sentence to you, and you serve that sentence, and you, good Lord, I'm really about to piss people off because branches are falling. You serve that sentence, you get out, you're free, whatever, you're back into society. I think that you should get your rights back. I don't think that it should be an additional process that costs thousands of dollars and years to essentially be granted the same rights as a free man. If you're a free man after you have served your sentence, I think you should get your rights back. Now, again, I say this as somebody that has never been incarcerated, that has never been convicted of anything. I'm not a criminal. I have no personal bias towards those laws one way or the other. So actually, if anything, I have bias the other way, having had a family member murdered. So you can look at that situation and say, okay, well, if they were a violent felon, why should they have a gun back? Well, if they're truly a danger to society, why are they out in the first place? They should be summarily executed or not allowed to see the light of day again, in my opinion. But if you, especially when it comes to things like non-violent felonies, once you've served your sentence, you get out, you should get your rights back. So that one there, I went down a little diatribe. There is that. To kind of go hand in hand with that, I support the Second Amendment, but a lot of times here, nobody needs AR-15s, nobody needs AK-47s or insert whatever. Typically, there's a kind of a checklist there. If the gun has wood on it, with the exception of the AK, they're normally all right with it. An SKS with a duckbill conversion to take 30-round mags, I've heard very few people argue against that. But for some reason, the AK gets hate. The AR gets hate, but the Mini 14 doesn't. So again, it makes no sense. But we go back to what we went back to before. Even if you personally don't care about owning an AR or an AK or what have you, one day they will come for something you care about. And if you're okay with legislation banning those things, then by virtue of that, you should be fine with us being okay if they ban your lever actions or bolt actions, pump actions. I wouldn't be, but we got to have consistency there. So you frequently encounter that as well as in with your Fudds. A lot of times your Fudds are perfectly okay owning guns for hunting or precision shooting, rifle shooting, target, pistol, bullseye competition, things like that. Their guns are of a very pragmatic nature when it comes to hunting or target shooting, and it's all very precision target shooting. Where they start getting a little rustled is when you start having guns that are purpose-built for defensive use, or you have competitions built around speed, less on the precision. You know, you're not stacking all 5 rounds on top of each other, but you do have scoring zones, things like that, with sports like IDPA and USPSA. Their guns, Fudds guns, are typically bolt action, lever action, more hunting, and they don't care about your semi-auto pistols, your tactical stuff, your self-defense oriented stuff, and they don't care about legislation pertaining to those. And sometimes they'll tell you that point blank. They support you having your guns, but they don't necessarily think that you need that AR-15 or that Terran Tactical Combat Master or that Glock, whatever. And there is that. They also typically will own guns for hunting or think that their shotgun for home defense is enough, but they may not carry a gun. They don't see the merit in carrying a sidearm for personal protection, and whether that's based off of I don't want to learn how to use a sidearm for personal protection, or they legitimately believe the world is such a place where that's not a prudent decision, I don't know. That could vary wildly individually. For the people that think that the world is not in such a state where carrying a sidearm is a prudent decision for many people, some of that may be age related. And I don't say that disparagingly, it's just the world has changed in a lot of ways. There's a lot more people on it, and with that, the ratio of bad people to good people, more people in general means more bad people willing to do bad things. So if it is age related, a lot of times growing up with Mayberry versus College Park is a lot different. And I'm willing to cut folks some slack there, especially if they have remained somewhat well insulated to the amplified violence and just the scale of things that we see now with the social unrest and rioting and all that goes with it. So if that is an age thing, it's an age thing, and I'll probably be in the same boat when I'm that age where in my mind some things are still the same way they were as they are now. Hopefully better, but I'm not naive enough to think that we're going that way. Sometimes elder Fudds or Fudds that are a little bit older will cling to outdated points of information or outdated concepts, and you will sometimes run into this with even younger folks that have spent time around an older demographic that still believes these things like knockdown power. There's really no such thing. There's laws of physics. If a gun has enough energy for the projectile to put a person literally on their butt involuntarily, then by virtue of physics, that gun also, the recoil would do the same to you. Now, there are several instances where people are shot and they fall down, and there's been some interesting takes on the psychology of that, where they believe it's due to conditioning from TV and movies, where that's what we're supposed to do if we're shot. When we get shot, we fall down. But in terms of knockdown power, typically not going to see that on a human target, regardless of what you're using. So there is that. Stopping power is another one that's, I cut a little bit of slack, but even stopping power is predominantly shot placement instead of caliber. So there is that as well. There is the rumor about 22s that refuses to die, that they ricochet around. We covered that in the first video, but we'll go over it again. The 22 bouncing around, it just doesn't happen that way. So bullets can go in and deflect off bone. And that has been demonstrated before, where a bullet can go in, if this is your rib cage, and it hits at this angle and tracks along with the bone. But in terms of it going around like a ping pong ball, it's just not going to happen. And even if it did impact the bone at such an angle that it kind of redirected back or bounced, it has lost so much velocity doing that maneuver that it's not going to zip around in there like people say it will. So there is that. I'm not completely knocking 22. I'm not saying don't carry a 22. I'm not attacking 22. If you have watched my channel, you know that I like 22s. You know that I even carry one from time to time as the situation dictates, or as a backup or whatever. I think a 22 in the hands of a capable shooter is better than a 45 in the hands of a not capable shooter. A hit with a 22 is better than a miss with a 50. I've said that a million times. Shot placement is still king. But 22 is not the bounce around 100% death round that some people make it out to be. If you have been on Facebook and unfortunate enough to run across some of the ads out there that start with, as a veteran, I say that no American needs an AR-15, or as law enforcement veteran, or whatever. A lot of times these qualifiers are tossed out there, and as a veteran, in the context of gun rights and things like that, it doesn't really mean that much. We have talked before how military and law enforcement are not by default gun experts. You can have somebody in either one of those two occupations that happens to become an expert on things that they were issued, or even guns they were not, because of their own interest in the subject, but they're not teaching, just weapons in a broad spectrum in either of those. Maybe a little bit more in law enforcement than military, just for identification on the street. But I think that we have all met that cop that qualifies semi-annually, and that's it. So the job title alone does not denote any kind of expertise or authority when it comes to gun rights. At least in my opinion, it does not. And again, I say that as a veteran. My veteran status has zero bearing on why you should listen to me when it comes to self-defense or reviews or whatever, if you even think you should listen to me in the first place. I just kind of put out there my opinions and thoughts, and if they resonate with you and you feel like I've given you ample reason to use that information in your own personal life, great. If not, well, I'm open to discussing it in the comments. But just because somebody is a veteran, or just because somebody was law enforcement, if they espouse anti-Second Amendment, whatever, them being a veteran or law enforcement veteran does not magically give them an additional leg to stand on with that stuff. Along with misinformation is kind of the misinformation surrounding things like body armor. That it's illegal, or that people shouldn't have it, or why people would want it if they're not criminals. I own body armor. You guys have seen that on the channel. I train with a group of guys that have body armor, and that training even a lot of times misunderstood. Most of us in the training are veterans. So in other words, it's not some weird G.I. Joe fantasy. We signed on the dotted line. We went in the military. It's just camaraderie and the chance to keep those team-based skills and hone them as it pertains to this environment, in case things ever got that bad. Not saying that they will, not trying to stoke fear or anything like that, but just kind of the misunderstanding that goes with that. So there is that. I do think it's important to note that having preferences or dislikes, like disliking AR-15s or tactically styled guns, that in and of itself doesn't make you a Fudd. I don't like every gun produced, and I don't expect anybody else to as well. So simply having a dislike, or that's not your preference, that's fine. It's when you are okay with legislation banning things that you don't like, or it's when you try to tell somebody else that they don't need X, Y, and Z on the tactical realm because all you need is down here. That goes with it too. Let's go over some of my favorite all you need arguments that I've heard straight from the horse's mouth, or Fudd's mouth, as it may be. Guy comes in, he's with his wife. She is supposed to be picking out a gun for her to carry, and we've kind of discussed this a little bit on the channel, where whoever's going to be carrying the gun needs to have the biggest voice and the biggest decision making on this, right? I wouldn't pretend like I know what's going to fit my wife's hand the best, and well, you get the drift. But all you need is a 5-shot J-frame, double action only, 642 airweight Smith & Wesson. Fine firearm. If you have the time and the money for ammo to get used to such a gun, fine firearm. Virtually any semi-automatic 9mm is going to be easier to operate out of the box than the 642. But because the Fudd lore persists that all women need are a small J-frame revolver, that's what he was going to make her go with. Bit of a weird situation for me behind the counter when my opinion is not needed, asked for, whatever, at all. He's pretty much decided everything. I'm just the guy doing the paperwork. So I kind of, I leave well enough alone. Now, if she were to ask me, I would take her through the full gamut and let her figure out what's going to feel the best, what can she manipulate the slide on, what is she comfortable with in terms of size, and all that. So the just point the women to the J-frames, it's kind of doing them a disservice. So there is that. All you need is a pump action shotgun for home defense. Maybe, maybe not. We've discussed this quite a bit on the channel before. More importantly, you hear all you need is to rack the shotgun and that's going to make them go away. Maybe, maybe not. And if it doesn't, what then? If all you have heard is all you need to do is rack the shotgun, and you've never trained past that, you've never trained for an eventuality where that fails, or as I said in the last Fudd video, maybe they're deaf and they didn't hear, they didn't get the memo. If you have a deadly force tool, its purpose, what it's designed to do, if it functions appropriately, is to apply deadly force by virtue of firing, and you have never fired that gun or trained to fire that gun in times of duress, on the hope that the sound of you making ready that firearm is enough, that's not a good recipe. So in an ideal situation, perfect. First of all, hopefully nobody breaks in, right? You lock your doors, you have an alarm system, dogs, whatever, deterrents, keep it well lit. There's all sorts of stuff that you can do to make gaining entry into your home as unattractive as possible to begin with. So best case scenario, nobody breaks in. Worst case scenario, they break in. Best worst case scenario, they break in, they hear you rack the shotgun, they leave. But there's other things to consider. They hear you rack the shotgun, now maybe they're armed, they now know you're armed. That changes the way they approach things if they continue. We could discuss this for infinity and all that good stuff, but that argument really kind of doesn't sit well with me, because what then? What if it doesn't work? The racking the shotgun is not the be all end all. Shoot to wound is another one. I'm not going to shoot to kill, I'm going to shoot to wound. Well, nobody's really shooting to kill, right? You're shooting to stop the threat. You're shooting to make the aggressor stop doing what they were doing that puts you in fear of grievous bodily harm or death. Typically what's taught is center mass a given target. 80% of people shot with a handgun survive. That'll be my source down in the description if you doubt that. But 80% of people shot with a handgun survive. So there is that. But you are shooting to stop the threat, not necessarily to kill. But shooting to wound is typically involving shooting some arm or leg shot or something like that. And that's a bad idea for a number of reasons. But number one, center mass a given target in an adrenaline dump situation is already hard enough. That's well documented, pretty much well agreed upon. Hence why police officers, I believe, made 17% accuracy with their shootings. So, and they are, sadly, with most of the civilian population, they are a little bit higher trained than the average person, especially the person espousing that particular argument. So it does pain me to say that. Civilians, do better, myself included. So if it's already hard to hit this in one of those fight or flight moments, then hitting an arm or a leg is going to be a little bit harder. And then the assumption that the arm or the leg isn't going to be a fatal wound is, well, it's just not accurate. You've got all sorts of brachial arteries in your arm, you've got your femorals, you've got your subclavian arteries up here. The body is one giant sack of blood and highways for that blood, and they go through your limbs. So you could still be a very fatal shot. And then the added liability, this area of the body in general has a lot more meat to it and a lot more substance to stop expanding ammunition, like self-defense hollow points, than does, say, an arm or in a leg. So while you could still get passed through with center mass and it could still hit somebody else, the likelihood of that happening is much lower than going for an arm shot or a leg shot where the bullet could pass straight through and hurt a non-combatant, which would not be good, both legally, morally, all that good stuff, ethically, whatever. So yeah, there's a reason this is what's taught. I know somebody's going to correct me on that and be like, well, it's center mass a given target, not just center mass. That's correct. Whatever you have in your ability to take a shot at is center mass a given target. But ideally, center mass. There, I hope that clears that up, and I got ahead of that particular brand of whatever comment. But yes, this little area is what you should be going for. Arms and legs and other tertiary, foots. I did hear somebody say once if somebody broke in their house, they weren't going to shoot them in the chest or the head or anything like that. They were going to shoot them in the foot. Props to your confidence and your accuracy skills in that kind of environment. I'm not there. I'm not taking foot shots on a home invader. Just not that confident. And I think he was using a 30-06 for home defense too. So I hope nobody lived downstairs. So that would suck. The final type of FUD that we're going to discuss real quick is probably going to be the most contentious one. That's probably going to get me some hate in the comments, and that's fine. I'm not necessarily saying that if this is you, it makes you a FUD, but it is one definition that I've heard, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. And that's going to be the gun owners with an aversion to modern training techniques, modern time-based pressure training techniques. And I'm going to go ahead and posit an opinion that may or may not be popular, might be controversial, and I don't mean it to be a personal attack or whatever disclaimer I need to put in there to keep you from getting ass mad in the comments at me. I think some of that comes from it's easier to remain as is than to as could be. I know for my own for a while, I didn't want to train to a 1.5 second draw to first shot because that meant admitting that I was too slow now. I didn't want to work on time pressure because that meant that I was too slow. That implied that I was not quite fit to be the defender of my home and hearth. Well, it does and it doesn't. Regardless of where we're at, we should always be pushing a little bit harder, right? From a training perspective, if defensive carry and defensive use of a firearm is something you care about, we should never rest on our laurels, because anything we do defensively is predicated on being one step behind the aggressor. We're already at a disadvantage. Why put ourselves more so? And I know somebody's going to say, well, it's a flat range, or it's nobody's shooting back at you, and that's absolutely true. With the exception of simunition training, which still doesn't have the stakes that a real gunfight does, obviously, you're not going to get that. You're not going to get that fudge factor of somebody else sending stuff back at you that hurts. Airsoft does to an extent, but it's not the same. So I get that, but there's a reason the training is pushing you to this level in the hopes that if something breaks loose, you hit here. Whereas if you're here, you get the drift. You sweat and you train hard, not so that you're going to perform right there. I mean, ideally that would be great, but I think realistically we all know we're going to be a little bit below whatever our best times are out here, but still pushing ourselves so that if that ever happens, we perform as best as we can. That muscle memory is on point. These are things that we have drilled to. And I know people think that the shot timer, that beep, oh, you're not going to react if you don't hear that beep. I don't think that's true. BJ Baldwin, competitive shooter, off-road racer, whatever, was in a self-defense shooting. He uses a timer. He seemed to perform okay. And I'm sure there's more I could list that I'm drawing a blank on right now. The reality is that the time gives you an objective metric to focus on. So there is that, and working on it, I think, can only pay off in good things for any of us. So regardless of where you're at, Jerry Michalek is probably still trying to be faster than he is. So this isn't slamming anybody that shoots worse or better than me. There's probably a lot of you out there that can definitely outshoot me. So I'm not acting like I am the fastest gun in the West or anything like that, but I'm better than where I started, and hopefully not as good as I'll be tomorrow. But there is that specific little subsection that came up when I was discussing Fuddery, and since this is the Compendium on Fuddery, as best I could do it, I needed to throw that in there. A resistance to modern training techniques, whether based on lack of initiative on their part or just security in what they already know. So there is that. I hope this has been helpful. We may add to this down the road. I don't mean to keep harping on Fuddery, but it came up enough times in the comments that there were different definitions that I had failed to include. So I tried my best to include them here. So yeah, there we go. Guys, stay safe. Keep shooting. If you're following the Fudd checklist, examine why. And, you know, from a legal side of things, I'd appreciate if you didn't do that anymore. Quit being okay with rights being stripped away from us, because eventually they will come for something you care about. And all that good stuff. So I'll see you next time, guys.